Egypt, once the stronghold of ancient civilizations, the granary of the Roman Empire, and the coveted treasure of all the great rulers of the Middle East and beyond. Over the millennia, several rulers ruled from Memphis, Alexandria, and Cairo over the Nile and large parts of the fertile surrounding area. In the Middle Ages, Egypt was first targeted by the Muslim Arabs, then by Christian crusaders from Europe, and finally by Mongolian steppe warriors from Asia. But after Sultan Saladin dealt the Crusaders a severe blow and re-established Muslim rule over Palestine, a whole new state suddenly established itself on the Nile. A state founded by the Mamluks, military slaves who had been sold from regions such as Ukraine and the Caucasus to Muslim rulers in the Middle East. After decades of involuntary service, these bonded elite fighters seized power, deposed Saladin's dynasty, and henceforth ruled a significant portion of the Middle East themselves from Egypt. Within a few years, they drove the Crusaders out of the Levant. And under the command of the Mamluk Sultan Baibars, a Kipchak Turk ex-slave, the Mongols suffered their first ever major defeat in 1260. The Mamluks thus also ended large-scale Mongol invasions. Under their rule, Egypt flourished anew. But who were these slaves who, apart from great military achievements, had invested a lot in cultural institutions, from the Nile to Syria, and also had diplomatic skills? How did these slaves, mostly of Turkish and Circassian origin, manage to rise to become the rulers of Egypt and the Levant in the first place? And what was the significance of the Mamluk Empire for the wider history of the Middle East and the Mediterranean? It is time to get to the bottom of these questions. Welcome to the Khan's Den. From the shrublands along the coast to the Mediterranean, through the Nile Delta to the numerous deserts and oases in the south, Egypt is first and foremost known as the region where one of the world's first advanced civilizations emerged. Along with the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the North Indian cultures on the Ganges, and the Xia dynasty in northern China, human culture flourished in Egypt. From professional agriculture to urbanization, to a complex society consisting of farmers, workers, merchants, and warriors, Egypt is now considered to be the homeland of one of the first great civilizations. The Nile, which gathers at the delta from the Mediterranean and splits into two tributaries in Nubia, was one of the main reasons Egypt had food in abundance. That aside, its geostrategic location, much like that of Turkey to the north, is historically significant. Egypt, as a passage from Africa to Eurasia, was literally the gateway to another world. But even long after the downfall of ancient Egypt with its pharaohs, the land on the Nile remained in the sites of numerous great empires in antiquity and the Middle Ages. The successors of Alexander the Great established the longest-lived of all the Diadoche empires here, and spread Hellenism here and there. Later, after the de facto annexation by Julius Caesar, the Romans rejoiced in being able to supply their soldiers in Germania with food from the Nile. And under the rule of the Byzantine Empire, Egypt blossomed into one of the most important places for Orthodox Christianity. But with the advent of the Muslim Arabs from the southeast, things changed forever. For nearly 600 years, Egypt remained in the hands of the Muslim caliphates, beginning with the Rashidun Caliphate in the 7th century and ending with the Ayyubid dynasty in the 13th century. During this period, the ancient Egyptian, as well as Christian traditions were mixed with the new Muslim beliefs. The land of Egypt became the headquarters of the Muslim world under the Ayyubids, the dynasty of Sultan Saladin, which was also related to the fact that the last real caliphate, with a claim to rule over the entire Islamic world, that of the Abbasids in Baghdad, had long since crumbled. This was accompanied by political fragmentation in North Africa and the Middle East. Even in Andalusia, the center for high culture in the Middle Ages, several Muslim dynasties ruled in turn, warring not only with the Christian states, but also with each other. Then, when the Crusades began around 1100 and thousands of Christian crusaders from Europe landed in the Levant, Egypt faced a decision of direction. For the religious zealots from the so-called Frankish lands had their sights set not only on Jerusalem and other holy sites of Christendom, but precisely on the former granary of the Romans. The largely Muslim-led lands in the region were no longer united under one caliph. The one great powerful authority simply no longer existed, for even the Turkish Seljuks, who had sparked the crusade, had long since split into two. But a certain Saladin united the forces and put an early end to the reveries of the kings and popes of Europe. At the famous battle at the Horns of Hattin in Galilee, his army defeated the enemy army, which was composed of warriors who had rushed into the field on behalf of the Crusader states. The army that Saladin had led was stronger. But both armies had one thing in common: there were Turks among the soldiers. Of the approximately 22,000 Crusaders, 4,000 of them were so-called Turcopoles. A Turcopole was not necessarily someone of mixed Turkish-Polish descent, but a man who came from a Turkish family and had been hired as a mercenary by Europeans. Besides Anatolian Turks, there were also the Pechenegs, one of the great Oghuz tribes, and in addition probably Greeks and native Syrians. They all fought on behalf of Christianity against the Muslims. But people with a Turkish background were also in action on the other side. Of Saladin's estimated sometimes 20,000 soldiers, nearly 12,000 belonged to the Mamluk Guard. The term Mamluk describes slaves who had to learn martial arts in the service of their master and, if necessary, take up arms. A Mamluk was released by the master after some time, but he had to remain loyal and serve in the household. He was thus a dedicated mercenary with a firm bond, rather than a humiliated slave, as would be our image from history classes. Most of the Mamluks who served and fought in Egypt under Saladin and his successors were Kipchaks. The Kipchaks were a Turkic people who migrated westward from the Altai in Central Asia after the collapse of the Second Göktürk Khaganate. By the time of the Crusades, the Kipchaks then ruled a broad swath from Central Asia, across the Ukrainian steppes to Bulgaria. These Tengrist Turks have gone down in history as so-called Cumans. However, because the Cuman Empire was actually made up of many different tribes and even federations, a significant number of Turkic warriors also reached the Middle East. Unlike the Oghuz Turks, who had previously been sold as slaves to the Arabs and had to serve their Arab commanders, the Kipchaks ended up in Egypt. They rose to become elite soldiers thanks to their excellent martial skills and, similar to the Oghuz Turks under the Abbasids, served the Ayyubid Sultan himself. Sultan as-Salih was the last of the Ayyubid rulers. As viceroy, he had once bought in 1,000 more Mamluks from Syria and Arabia, who later loyally assisted him. So not all Mamluks were of Turkish origin, but most of them. The warriors from the Eurasian steppes were simply excellent fighters on horseback, as well as on foot, given the climatic as well as economic situation. However, the supposedly loyal military slaves came into conflict with their master around the year 1250. The trigger was, of all things, a crusade by European forces. And so, the era of Mamluk rule dawned. Sultan as-Salih was under pressure. He had assured those Mamluks who had faithfully stood by him as viceroy of previously unheard of privileges. With their help, he defeated several smaller Crusader states. But just when he had scheduled the siege of the Syrian city of Homs, to spite not any Christians, but his cousin and fellow Ayyubid, news of a new crusade reached him. Louis IX, King of France, had personally landed in Cyprus with a large Crusader army and obviously wanted to invade Egypt from there. Louis planned to realize the dream of his predecessors. Therefore, Salih broke off the siege in Syria and retreated to Egypt. Because of the weather conditions, Louis's troops spent the winter of 1248 in isolation in Cyprus, several hundred of them dying of disease. Meanwhile, the king had been making diplomatic efforts in the Levant to mobilize against the Ayyubids. He even agreed with the Mongols to launch parallel attacks against the Muslims. Then, on May 19, 1249, the Crusaders finally launched their invasion and set out by sea for Egypt. They took the city of Damiette almost without a fight. This was a devastating setback for Salih, because now the attackers had access to a heavily fortified former Crusader stronghold and supplies. Salih was so incensed that he had some 4 dozen Banu Kanana tribal warriors who had cleared the city without a fight, strangled. Only through a veto by the Mamluks in his army did he refrain from further punishment. At the same time, the Sultan fell ill. Just before the Crusaders and the Ayyubids clashed at Al-Mansura in the winter of 1249, Salih died. This greatly diminished the morale of the Ayyubids, for their rule was not secured. Salih's successor, Turan Shah, was still stationed in Hazenkif, in Anatolia. While in Egypt, a favorite slave of Salih tried to put her son on the throne, Robert of Artois launched a surprise attack on the Muslim army. The Ayyubids were overrun, their leading commander killed before he could even put on any armor. Chaos broke out in the camp, and many Ayyubid soldiers retreated. However, when Artois took up their pursuit, he fell into the trap of the Mamluks who had been among those who had fled. A certain Mamluk called Baibars had lured him here. Artois escaped badly wounded, his heavy cavalry worn down, and destroyed in the narrow streets. King Louis simultaneously set about besieging the city of Al-Mansura. But Baibars' troops launched a counterattack. The Crusaders were defeated, partly because of heavy losses due to disease. When Turan Shah arrived in the spring of 1250 and defeated the Crusaders at Feriskour, Louis and his troops finally withdrew. But Baibars followed them to Damiette and captured Louis along with his army. While Turan Shah ordered the execution of almost all the prisoners, he had the French king thrown in chains into the dungeon. He was then able to negotiate his release and that of high-ranking barons. All the remaining prisoners were ordered into slavery in Baghdad. Suddenly, however, Louis's bargaining chip changed, for Turan Shah had been murdered by the Mamluks. What had happened? Why did the loyal Kipchaks turn against their new master? We find answers in the behavior of the new sultan, because Turan Shah wanted to get rid of the Mamluks. The slaves at the Ayyubid court had become too powerful for him to tolerate them, along with his own rule as the rightful sultan. The Mamluks, as the crusade showed, had political influence over Sultan Salih. It was then Salih's former harem wife, Shajar ad-Dur, who secretly informed the Mamluks of Turan Shah's plans. She hoped to play both of them off against each other and seize power herself. At least under a pretextual hand, with the help of her son as the new sultan. The Mamluks therefore beat Turan Shah to the punch. On May 2nd, Baibars stabbed the actual sultan in Feriskour. He fell on the escape from a wooden tower into the Nile. After this rather cinematic assassination, chaos set in Egypt. Shajar ad-Dur wanted to finally proclaim her son as Sultan of the Ayyubids, but the Mamluks knew how to prevent this. They forced her marriage with Aybak, one of their own. Aybak was to become the new ruler, while she was allowed to stand by his side. She thus retained her previous authority at court, but ceded her claim to the throne to the Mamluks. And thus also that of the Ayyubids. However, Aybak was aware of the difficult situation of his Mamluks. Most of his people came from the Ukrainian Khazarian steppe. They were Turks, most of whom are described in European, as well as Arab chronicles, as tall and with Asian faces. From this point of view, there was a discrepancy between the Kipchak Turkic Mamluk caste on the one hand, and the native Muslims, as well as Christian Egyptians among the people on the other. Therefore Aybak gave the modest. He asked the caliph in Baghdad to act as a mediator. After some power struggles between the remaining members of the Ayyubids with the Mamluks, the caliph proposed a partition. Faced with the Mongol campaign in Iraq, he wanted to see his co-religionists united, not fighting with each other. As part of the agreement, the Ayyubid emirs retained the Levant and parts of Palestine. Egypt, however, went to the Mamluks, along with the Sinai. Aybak had succeeded in a coup. He had thus won recognition of his rule by the caliph, the de jure head of all Muslims. And he did not allow other powerful Mamluks even near his throne. While putting down several rebellions in Middle and Upper Egypt, he also got rid of the Salihia Mamluks, those slaves that had once been hired or bought by the late Salih. One of them had been Baibars, Kipchak Turkic Muslim war hero. Aybak therefore had their leader killed, Oktay. Once again, the cards were reshuffled in Egypt. Many of Oktay's Mamluks suddenly fled the Nile to Syria and joined their enemies, the Ayyubids of all people. Baibars was also among them. Only a few stayed behind, including a certain Kutuz. Aybak nevertheless came into danger. After several years of intrigue, his forced wife, the harem slave Shajar al-Dur, turned against him and had him murdered while bathing. Those Mamluks who had sided with Aybak, however, did not believe her that Aybak had died suddenly in the night and locked her up in a tower. Later they found her lying beaten to death in the mud in front of the entrance. Onlookers had seized her many valuable jewels. Only after several days was she buried. Kutuz's Mamluks placed Aybak's son, Nureddin Ali, on the throne. However, as a 14 or 15-year-old boy, he remained a puppet of Kutuz's Mamluks, who continued to call the shots. During these few years of crusades, intrigues, and rebellions, another danger had been brewing from the east that eclipsed all the enemies of the Mamluks: the Mongol Empire. For while the Ayyubids, Crusaders and Mamluks had been fighting in alternating coalitions over a piece of land in the Levant, the Mongols had arrived in Syria under the rule of Hülegü. Being the grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, he expanded the Mongols' sphere of influence to include large parts of Anatolia and the Middle East. His armies advanced in two directions. One was to Baghdad, the seat of the Caliph, and the other was to Syria. Since the Mongols at that time had the reputation of being an unstoppable, even invincible nation, and moreover all factions in the region were already weakened, the Mamluks had to reckon with an invasion into Egypt as well. A new war was on the horizon. But with every disaster comes an opportunity. Simply put, Baibars' time had come. The history of the Mongols is well known. After many years of anarchy, a steppe warrior named Temujin gathered all the tribes and clans in Mongolia, united them under his banner, and then proclaimed himself universal ruler. His new name was Genghis Khan. He then embarked on a kind of world domination campaign, conquering large parts of Asia with his nomadic warriors in tow. Genghis Khan's empire was called Mongol Ulus, and Genghis derives from the ancient Turkic word for sea, Tengiz. Ulus also meant something like nation in ancient Turkic, a term that is still used in modern Turkish. Temujin's sometimes violent unification of the nomadic tribes included those who had been part of a Turkic people, such as the neighboring Naimans and Karaits. Accordingly, a significant part of the Mongol horde consisted of Turks. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his sons took over the administration of the empire, which they divided into 4 zones. By then, the Mongols had literally overrun other Turkic peoples in Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe. And the Chinese, whom they had defeated and enslaved in East Asia, were sent to the western part of their empire to take advantage of their knowledge of siege techniques. After the Mamluks had repelled the crusade and driven the Ayyubids out of Egypt, they were now confronted with the Mongol Empire, parts of which consisted not only of volunteers, but also military slaves. Just like their own dynasty. At that time, Munka ruled over the Mongol Khaganate. His father had once destroyed the Turco-Persian Khorasan Empire, dealing an economic blow to the Islamic-influenced world, and causing a shock wave that was felt as far away as Egypt. Munka now assigned his younger brother, Hülegü, the task of defeating the remaining Muslim states. Those who surrendered in advance were to be treated with leniency, and all others were to be punished with the utmost severity. This was in line with the strategy of the Mongols, who were Tengrist, but partly already Christian and Muslim-influenced. Sometimes the mere rumor that the Mongols were on the advance was enough for a city to surrender to the attackers without a fight. But when the Mongols arrived in the Middle East, they did indeed meet resistance. After defeating the Seljuks at Khosdag, the Mongols rose to become the rulers of Anatolia. The Rum Seljuks and the Empire of Trebizond became their vassals. Because the Anatolian resistance struggle also included armed Syrian volunteers who had fought against the Mongols, the Mongol warriors moved further south. They took control in large parts of Syria, which at that time had still belonged to the Ayyubid Sultanate. But Sultan as-Salih took no further attempt to stop the Mongols, and thus missed an opportunity to slow their advance into the center of the Islamic world. Now that the Mamluks were providing the sultans in Egypt, Hülegü's forces were already in what is now Iraq. They besieged Baghdad in 1258, also with the help of soldiers from Georgia, Armenia, and Frankish crusaders from the Principality of Antioch. This event is associated by historians with the end of the Islamic Golden Age. The city was depopulated and left in ruins after the occupation. Mongol soldiers looted the mosques, libraries, and reportedly even hospitals as punishment for Baghdad's failure to surrender in advance. The House of Wisdom, where thousands of books and chronicles were stored, was destroyed. It is said that the Tigris River turned black from the ink of those books that had been thrown into the river by the Mongols. In any case, Baghdad was indeed hit hard by the looting. Economically, the whole surrounding area took great damage. Most importantly, the Abbasid dynasty came to an end. Al-Mustasim, the last caliph, was initially spared by the Mongols. He was, after all, a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, but then killed without bloodshed as a precaution. His family was executed immediately. All the conquests, plundering and bloodshed had left a great impression on Egypt. The Mamluks of Kutuz, who was in charge behind the scenes, were aware of the danger of the Mongols. They first re-established the Abbasid Caliphate, this time based in Cairo. The new caliphs were composed of the descendants of refugees from Baghdad. Then the Mamluks began a counteroffensive on their part in Syria. However, there was a third faction that caused them great headaches: the Christian Crusaders. For some of them had allied themselves with the Mongols, whom they assumed were Nestorian Christians. However, the hopes of the Christians in the Middle East that they could use the Mongols in the fight against the Muslim states did not come true, for Pope Alexander IV forbade the Christians to cooperate with the Mongols. Nevertheless, some Christian princes cozied up to the steppe warriors and were therefore punished by the Church. In order to understand the ambivalent relationship between the Crusaders and the Mongols, and thereby also to expand our mosaic of the triad with the inclusion of the Mamluks, we make a small excursion to Europe. Of course, the Mongols had left their mark here as well. The European leaders, the clergy and businessmen, but also the common man reacted as horrified to the approaching Mongol armies as the Middle East. On April 9, 1241, an army of Silesian and Polish soldiers faced the invaders at Liegnitz. The Europeans were crushed, and Henry II, Princeps of Silesia and Poland, was killed. The Mongol army was led by Bata Khan and marched on to Hungary. There it met resistance again only 2 days later. This time, the Mongol army, consisting of 15,000 to 30,000 horsemen, defeated a Hungarian army composed of Knights Templar and archers. Once again, the Mongols won a victory, this time at Mohi in Hungary. The Mongols had actually advanced this far to punish the King of Hungary, Bela IV, for taking in Cumans and Kipchak refugees. After the battle, the king fled to Austria, where he was granted asylum. The Mongol Empire had conquered large parts of Hungary, Ruthenia, the northern Carpathians, and Transylvania only shortly after their arrival in Europe. The extremely brutal approach caused hysteria throughout Europe. Under the widespread assumption that the Mongols were targeting Bohemia, a new crusade began this time against the Tengrist Mongols. German church representatives declared land peace so that all small principalities could focus militarily on the invaders. Conrad IV, King of Germany and Italy, from the Hohenstaufen family, declared himself the leader of the crusade. The son of the German emperor had been symbolically proclaimed King of Jerusalem and seized the opportunity to establish himself as a worthy successor to his father. His father declared the fight against the Mongols a Christian duty and had his messages spread to France, Spain, England, Burgundy, Norway, and even as far as Cyprus, hoping to gather volunteers. After Conrad had gathered his armies in Nuremberg, he marched off to the east on January 7, 1241. But when he arrived in Weiden, nobody was to be found. The Mongols had already retreated. Apparently they were not too interested in the HRR. And since the regent of Conrad took advantage of his absence and started a rebellion at home, the German king was forced to disband his army. Although the legend spread in Europe and as far as Arabia that a German-Austrian army had defeated and ousted the Mongols just here in Weiden, it must therefore be emphasized that there was never any contact between Conrad's troops and the invaders. The Mongols had invaded Hungary as a punishment, plundered the County L, and retreated back to Ukraine. Such legends can be useful to motivate others to fight in the face of such a dangerous superiority as the Mongols. But they are simply invented. It should be mentioned here that the author and producer of this film also once witnessed such a legend narrative, namely, when his lecturer in a lecture on medieval history at a German university seriously claimed that the Mongols had already been defeated at the Battle of Liegnitz and had therefore retreated from Europe.
George is getting upset!
In the process, we have now seen that it was exactly the other way around. Moreover, Ogedei Khan, son of Genghis Khan, died in 1241. All Mongol generals and nobles, especially the family members, were therefore forced to stop their military operations, to turn back, and to elect the new Khan in Mongolia at the Kurultai. That is why the Mongols retreated so quickly, and later reappeared in Eastern Europe. However, the lecturer omitted this fact at that time. In general, she found it more important to give her students an 85-minute lecture on the eating habits of medieval Europe than to at least tell the truth about the Mongols in the remaining 5 minutes. But that's how it works in German universities. You just have to set priorities. But back to the facts. After the Mongols had left Europe, and 9 years later the crusade of Louis IX had failed, a paradigm shift slowly took place. For the Mamluks posed the greatest threat to the Crusader states from 1250 onward. Because the Mongols were also targeting Baghdad and Syria, they were seen, at least by some Europeans, as potential allies against the Muslims. In 1259, business was about to pick up. Hülegü crossed the Euphrates in September and advanced into Syria. Hethum I, king of Armenian Cilicia, immediately recognized the Mongols' suzerainty, hoping that the invaders would liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims in the name of Christianity. And this was only because Hülegü's family members had partially converted to Nestorian Christianity. However, since in the past the traditions of Tengrism have been confused with Nestorian Christianity, we focus on Hethum's political motivation. Bohemond IV was Prince of Antioch and Count of Tripoli at the same time, and enthusiastically welcomed the Mongols. When the Mongols conquered Aleppo, and shortly thereafter the Mongol general Kutbukha conquered the ancient city of Damascus, jubilation broke out among the local Christians. In joy, thousands got drunk on wine in the streets, rang all the church bells and burned down several mosques. And this all happened during the fasting month of Ramadan. The Mamluks took notice of these events. Kutuz then reconciled with Baibars and the other Salihia Mamluks, who were also known as Bari Mamluks. Hülegü had to retreat soon because Munka Khan had died, and he was needed on the Kuralte. At the same time, it is documented that Hülegü lamented the logistical expense of maintaining his army, and followed the old tradition of moving to the cool north during the summer months, just as the Turkic peoples had done. Accordingly, Hülegü left only a small part of his large army in the Levant. However, his attempt to force the Mamluks to surrender failed. Kutuz had Hülegü's envoys executed. Thereupon, the Mongol finally withdrew, leaving his general Kitbuka in command. A great, all-important battle was about to begin. Kutuz was under pressure, because after the Crusade and the internal power struggles in Egypt, he ruled the only remaining Muslim empire. All eyes in the Muslim world were on him and his Mamluks. Accordingly, he saw his chance had come to legitimize the Mamluks as the rightful rulers of Egypt by repelling the Mongols and, of course, to gather prestige and influence beyond Egypt. But Kutuz, Baibars and company also had personal reasons for opposing the Mongols. Almost all Mamluks were of Turkic Kipchak origin. Their homeland had been that of the Cumans. And that Cuman Empire was treated so badly by the Mongols that the flight of the Cuman nobility to Hungary had even caused the Mongol invasion and destruction of Hungary. Moreover, 2 decades earlier, Genghis Khan had waged an extremely brutal war against the Khorasan Shahs in Persia and Central Asia. Those were also Turkic-born warriors, politicians, and commoners. Although the Mongol Empire also consisted of Turkish soldiers, and the Turkish-Mongol symbiosis from earlier times was recognizable, the Mamluks must have taken the anti-Turkish actions of the Mongols personally. And so, in August 1260, Kutuz marched forward to Acre. There he learned that Kitbuka had crossed the Jordan River and entered Galilee. Kutuz pushed on through Nazareth and arrived at Ain Jalut on September 2nd. The next morning the story took its course. On one side were the Mongols and soldiers from the Kingdom of Georgia, which had been vassalized, as well as from Armenian Cilicia, from Rum-Seljuk territory, and from the Ayyubid emirs of Homs and Banias. Parts of the Ayyubids had joined the Mongols to corner the Mamluks. On the other hand, the Mamluks were supported by the Ayyubid emir of Kerak and his soldiers. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, while remaining impartial for fear of the Pope, benevolently granted the Mamluks access through their territory. In this way, Kutuz had managed to prevent the Mongols from proceeding quickly to the Holy Land. The Mamluk battle plan can be traced back to Baibars. Kipchak, experienced in warfare, relied on run tactics to provoke the Mongols into a major attack. Then he feigned a sudden retreat. But Hülegü became overconfident and attacked the fleeing Mamluks with his entire army in his rear, a serious mistake. For when the Mongols reached the highlands, flaming pillars were shot at them from everywhere. The Mamluks then advanced with their cavalry. The Mongols were surrounded on all sides. Since at the same time the Syrian allies of the Mongols left the battlefield, a fierce hand-to-hand fight ensued. According to the sources, Kutuz had been watching from a distance. When he saw that the left flank of the Mamluks had almost been defeated by the desperate Mongols, because the Mongols were looking for a way to escape, he took off his helmet so that all the warriors would recognize him. Then he rode onto the battlefield at lightning speed, uttering a religious shout, and motivating the Mamluks to fight even harder. Only a few Mongols managed to escape. Kitbuka died on the battlefield, as did most of his soldiers. Afterwards, the Mamluks did not let up. Only 5 days later they recaptured Damascus from the Mongols, and in October the city of Aleppo. The geopolitical consequences of the battle were immediately apparent. For the first time, an enemy army had defeated the Mongols on the battlefield. And they had not been numerically superior at all. Contrary to the stories about certain crusades in Nuremberg, this had not been an invention. But the Mamluks actually became legends. The Mongols were now no longer invincible. They would invade the Levant again and again later, but each time the defenders were aware that they were dealing with men, not monsters with magical powers. Actually, the victory was also a political success for the Mamluks, who had been able to protect the Holy Land as well as the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo from the Mongols. But on the way back to Egypt, Kutuz became the victim of a conspiracy. He had promised Baibars certain privileges as a reward for his work in Ain-Jalut, but had not put this into practice. Therefore, Baibars felt betrayed. On October 24th, he struck down Kutuz with his own hands. Shortly thereafter, he proclaimed himself the new sultan, and this time the entire Mamluk army recognized his rule, for after all the decades of merit in war, Baibars had proven two things. He was a capable warrior on foot, horseback and camel, but also a competent and intelligent leader on the battlefield. His tactics had helped the Mamluks win first against the Crusaders, then against the Mongols. The new sultan immediately absorbed many of the Bahri Mamluks into his leadership staff in Cairo. He also put down several rebellions. Only a few weeks later, an Ayyubid governor in Damascus appointed by Kutuz had rebelled against Baibars' rule, shortly followed by Kutuz's personal Mamluks. Baibars disposed of both dangers. And unlike the other sultans before him, as-Salih, Aybak, and Kutuz, Baibars knew how to win over the people. The Asian-looking Kipchak Turk from the steppe, tall, blue-eyed, and reportedly even blonde, took control of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt for 17 years. He then integrated most of the Levant into his empire, repeatedly putting the Crusaders and Mongols to flight. Thanks to his skills and due to geopolitical circumstances, the center of the Islamic world shifted from the Iraq-Iran area to Egypt. He even managed to conquer the kingdom of Makuria in Africa, which until then had been known as impregnable. After a total of 38 campaigns and 15 battles in which he himself took part, Baibars had established himself as a leading figure for all Mamluks, but also Muslims and perhaps Turkic peoples in the Orient. At Ain-Jalut, he was the first ruler ever to use the new handguns from China to put the Mongols to flight. Administratively, he expanded the postal service in Egypt so that messages from Cairo to Damascus could only be delivered within a few days, reminiscent of a similar system among the Mongols. Baibars also had many bridges, canals, ports, and mosques built. He financially supported the famous Arab physician al-Nafis, and because of the high status of cats in Islam, he included in his estate a special garden in Cairo to provide shelter and food for the city's cats. But new dangers were already looming on the horizon. The Mamluks ruled their territory stably for some time, but many figures, both from outside and inside the empire, were just waiting to end the rule of the Bahri dynasty.